Merci, Claude. So, ladies and gentlemen, Claude and the organizers took the wise decision of, as in Japanese culture, starting with the people who know least, because the program will tell you a lot about AI. I don't propose to do that in the time that I've been allotted, and Claude's very worried that I will run over, so I'll put my timer on. But the purpose that I thought I'd set myself as a generalist, as somebody who's worked on policy around AI innovation at the European level, and still I do that through the AI for People Foundation, is to think about what are the factors outside the technology, outside the applications, which probably also those who are driving the technology need to think about. Because, as we say in the world of public policy advice, where I now live a lot, technology push is not enough. So I've come today to suggest that there are 4 questions which all engineers and teams thinking about AI in the 3 domains that are the subject of this colloquium need to have in mind. Firstly, and it may sound obvious, but we are no longer in the world where we all grew up. The 45-24 world of a rules-based order is over. How do we respond to that? Secondly, we all want sovereignty. France wants sovereignty, the country of my birth wants sovereignty, the European Union talks about sovereignty. Do we achieve it alone or with others? And I think that increasingly in civilian as well as defense and security applications, that question of technological sovereignty will be a constraint on innovation and marketing. Thirdly, as a special case, and I'll talk a lot about that, can we engage more with Europe? And finally, although again, sometimes technologists say, I've got that fixed, have we thought enough both about ethics and about talking ethics with the market? So my hypothesis is that all of these questions are relevant to all the applications in these sectors and maybe beyond. The caveat is that maybe you'll feel, as I go through the speech, that it's too Franco-centric and too defense-driven, but here we are in Paris, and if you look around, the defense and security debate is the leading case for creating a social license to operate for AI innovation in Europe today. So the world that I, and probably many of you, spent our professional lives and perhaps still spend our professional lives creating is no more. The open, rules-based world order that came out of Bretton Woods, the GATT, the WTO, whether it's China-US fight or Europe-US disconnect, I don't know. This is a rather old slide. I'm not sure, and none of us know, whether by next year the image on the right will have to be more belligerent as well. But we are in what I call, therefore, the beginning of a century of unpeace. A Cold War with autocracy incorporated rather than a single Soviet rival. As a result, the stakes and power lines are more dispersed around the world, meaning that the transaction cost of fixing that and the opportunity costs of dealing with our security first are higher than in the 50s, but so are the costs of complacency. So cyber weapons, in addition, and the notion of unpeace comes out of an Oxford study on cyber from about 10 years ago. But cyber weapons, and this is also in the French literature, really create a world where it's no longer a case of the fighting people and civil defense, the old Cold War. We are all in some sense combatants now. So that means the West can't call the shots. We don't have the cards anymore. We will no longer have easy protection from the US, easy supplies from cheap suppliers. At the moment it's China, before it was Japan, but it's over. So we need to accept a long and hard road to do more by ourselves, for ourselves, without becoming North Korea. And I was talking to colleagues in the audience before we started. this is not where the world is today. So just this morning on the social media, ESA says the Trump election means we should double down on Iris Squared and Galileo. The next fact point in the social media stream is Kaja Kallas, the candidate for foreign relations in the new commission, saying, yes, but we need to be partners with the US. We don't know, we're a bit schizophrenic. We don't know how to reconcile those two things, but that's what we have to do. And as the report by the former Finnish president just out a couple of weeks ago makes clear, that means we have to look at all threats. The solution has to involve all of society, and even more difficult sometimes than the whole of society, it has to involve the whole of government. I won't go into the report, but it's fascinating, worth reading. So words like economic security and technology sovereignty were, I would say, edgy when Commissioner Breton began to talk about them 3-4 years ago in Brussels. Now they are mainstream. And I think part of the legacy of the last commission is that we have, for the first time, a commissioner for economic security and technology sovereignty, as well as a dedicated commissioner for space and defense. And I'll come to that later. But sovereignty is expensive. If we wanted to clear out all the hyperscalers from Europe and replace them with a European cloud, my colleagues in the Commission say it will cost 1.4 trillion euros. So maybe that's not the priority. How do we sequence, how do we prioritize technology sovereignty and our need at the moment to supply some things from some areas of the rest of the world? And that leads directly, my last bullet here, to the point, who are us? What if the next big AI breakthrough takes place in Switzerland? If it's Norway, it's okay. If it's the UK, it's not. So how do we define the frontiers which enable us to be sufficiently sovereign, but also to be sufficiently open? This is a scale of trade and economic cooperation. I haven't put the US in, but you can see that in the near abroad, we have the sad cross-channel cousins who left the European Union, but nonetheless still cooperate in many of the domains we're discussing here. And then we have the less near abroad, the like-minded. There are plenty of people to cooperate with. But then, and here it gets to the defense-heavy piece, NATO and European members of NATO are not spending enough on defense and security to actually drive security and tech sovereignty the way we want it. We know that America's very big and China's very big and we're not very big. So what do we do about that? We're not small. This, I think, is, especially in this setting in DGAC, a call not to be too pessimistic. The European Union of 27 makes up 25% of global top aerospace corporates output. And if you add in Norway and the UK, which of course Norway we might on defense, UK we only do sometimes, you have 40%. So the Americans are big, the Chinese, I fear, are very big, but we have cards to play. We lag on tech. This is a very disobliging Australian Strategic Policy Institute judgment, saying, you know, European countries, including France, lead in the top 5 on very few critical technologies. And I won't dig into the whole report. You can't just add the Europeans together because sometimes we lead in the same critical technologies, but it's clear that it's not just about output and spending, it's also about tech capacity, which is where innovation comes in. Since I'm in France, France of course is doing well, doing better on this. This is a composite, how are we doing on AI index. So you believe indices or you don't. The key point is that by the same metric, France is moving up and some other member states are fairly high as well. If you look at this chart, which is about VC in only generative AI, France was top in 23 according to this survey. But some of the headlines in the recent months suggest that maybe that's not always true. And here's a slide I borrowed from the Ministère des Armées, there's an ecosystem. And the ecosystem is not just in France. Here's one I borrowed from my friends in DG Defis in the Commission. The French ecosystem is also pretty well plugged into what research is going on in the defense space at the European Union level. So Europe has cards, France has cards, but we don't have enough. So we need, I think, firstly to assume that the world is not as we have known it, and that requires a bigger intellectual effort than we think. And part of the way to make that effort, I think, is to be more strategic, to think through the plan from a blank piece of paper. And I'm saying this in a conference on AI applications, because you can't just rely on the things on the other side of the wall being the same as they used to be. People used to say, build it and they will come. Throw your technology over the wall and somebody will pick it up. The world at the other side of the wall is not the same, so we need to think more about that. My second theme, just let me check on my time. My second theme is how do we do technology and sovereignty by cooperation or on our own? And this is the Charles de Gaulle in its first, in the spring, in its first NATO operation in the Mediterranean. So we do pool and share assets sometimes. But here's a better example where there's a great Franco-Italian rocket, but people are not prepared to buy it. They'd rather have the Patriot. So how do we deal with that? We have lots of Franco-German tanks and planes, at least on paper. That's why we're looking at Mrs. Merkel, but we don't have the projects launched quite yet. The UK plays the same game with the same people. And Keir Starmer has just confirmed, just before he came over for the ceremonies of the 11th of November, that this project between the UK and Italy and Japan, so how European is that, is back on track. And all of those are the big name corporations, both here in Paris, the Thierry Larsonneur report, and Mrs. von der Leyen in her speech in Prague in the summer, have been saying, if we're going to be serious in Europe, we can't just do this sort of big power cherry picking. We need also to integrate the Czechs and the Poles and the Swedes more into our mapping of opportunities. At the European Union level, that brings us back to the question, who are us? You can only join in if you have European control. And in theory, there are rules on that. They're rather complicated when you try to apply them. And if we look at one example, and I've decided not to avoid corporate names, as you'll see, how crazy is this? You know, the Italians get upset about Safran buying an Italian company, but they're buying it from an American. And they're upset in terms of technological sovereignty. And the makers of the Eurofighter are worried because Microtechnica makes important widgets for the Eurofighter. But in the end, this is a repatriation to Europe of an asset, and yet it took 6 months to agree. So we need more broad cooperation, and I think we need to work more beyond the EU. And I say here, maintaining design control, that's the sort of MBDA red line. But we need to decide more how we're going to determine what we really want. And in my personal opinion, having tried to run it from the inside of government, the current discussion, including in this town, about whether local content is the answer, and if so, is it 60% or 80%, that's not going to do it because people will game the system. Thirdly, and here I'll go relatively fast, what is Europe doing? Europe is, of course, well underway on AI innovation and regulation, and the new Commission is moving more into implementation, innovation, application, which is good. And it's trying to expand the scope for EU budget support by expanding the discussion of dual use. On the defense side, frankly, since 2016, there's been a lot of talk, but we're still subcritical. There's still a worry about whether you can do what the current Commission hearings talk about, i.e. a defence union, a single market for defence, and let's see what a white paper says in the first quarter of next year. So all these people are hoping to be confirmed by the European Parliament at least by Monday, but currently we're fighting. The key names to bear in mind, I think, for our purposes are Monsieur Séjourné, Mrs. Virkkunen, and Mr. Kubilius. So Kubilius is dealing with space and defense, and in space he talks a lot about space for defense. Iris Squared is his, Galileo is his, and space launch is his. So I think that this was part of a vast portfolio for Mr. Breton under the previous commission. We now have a former prime minister of a Baltic state focusing on it full time, space and defense, so that's an opportunity. And there will be a proposal for a space law. I know from my early conversations as a very recent arrival in the academy that this arouses some worries among space lawyers. Is it a bid for competence over space, which of course is precluded by the European treaties? It's not. It's going to, in my view, it's going to be an attempt to leverage people, I think Elon Musk, people's desire to access the European market, to sell space-related services, in order to make them do the right thing in terms of ensuring that those services don't create too much debris, maybe that they clean up, maybe that they don't use unwarranted subsidy. So that's space. On the defense side, all the right ambitions, not enough scale, and not enough on what could be the crucial issues, a special approach to mergers, a special approach to state aids, which were in the Draghi report. Industry players like Mr. Cingolani have been talking about it. Ministers like Le Maire and Habeck have been talking about it. The Commission, not so much yet. And the key point there, I think, is can we pool more without creating what I call, I haven't used these slides in Brussels, a Euro monster. So we have the right ideas. We don't have enough money. We have a debate which was launched under Mr. Breton. We have the EDA, which is already expanding its market from coordinating needs assessment to aggregating the demand that flows from that for joint procurement and supporting collaborative defense research and innovation. My joker would be to say, is part of the problem with the EDA that member states see it chaired by an EU authority figure? If it were, then maybe the deal would be to pool more money to use the EDA and to put a European defense minister in charge. Not a rotating every 6 months defense minister, but something a bit more stable. And I've talked about dual use in terms of goods, also for services and provision. The EDA is already working with César and airspace control to do the right thing. I put these slides on what's the baseline in Europe, just for reference in case anybody's interested. The point I would make, there's a lot going on. The price tags are too small. Air and space is in it, but France isn't. Not yet. The first 7 AI factories, which are sort of innovation clusters around high-performance computers, they've been announced this week. And there are 15 member states making different sorts of consortia to do the thing. And I was struck, just personally, I haven't dug behind it, that France is not, or not yet, leading such an initiative at European level. This is Henna Virkkunen, so she's the lady who's going to apply AI and do it in space and defense, and who will lead with Kubilius the European Defence Union white paper. So just so we know what she looks like. And you can see in the bottom of this slide the dual use angle. So that's already the way in which the Commission is trying to expand the vision of what AI could you support and cooperate on and procure with EU money. Of course, and we'll come to this later, but even Virkkunen in her hearings has had to say, but absolutely not SALA, absolutely not autonomous lethal systems. And so there is, and equally you can use cohesion fund money to support military spending, but not weapons and munitions. So there are limits, but I think we need to work on those limits, even if we don't have a definition. But we have to think about it not just as expanding work for defense companies, but also, if you look at the third tile, as a problem for civilian companies who are precluded from doing stuff that might be useful down the road for defense and security if they want to get support for cooperation. So there is scope to do more on AI, but as on defense, I think the debate is going to be, can we afford to pool, or are we better doing it on its own? And finally, as I said, there's much more in Draghi than there is so far in the Commission's policies, especially about mergers and state aids, but also if you look at the 5, 6, 7 on this list of points, active support for joint training of models in specific sectors. And so that's something which I think is very much worth thinking about in specialized verticals such as we're discussing today. So we need more shared planning between the industry leaders as well as the governments. We need a lot more money. Mr. Breton made a speech saying, I need 100 billion to do serious defense industrial policy work over 5 years. And in the end, the Commission has proposed 1.5. So clearly, if we stay at 1.5, the Commission will be a sort of interesting rock garden, and the EU will not be the place that drives stuff. The strategic question for government and business is, can we define a Europe in which we'd like to spend 100 and not 1.5? Final quick point. It's all right, Claude's not so worried. Ethics. I hesitated to put this in because we tend to say we are technologists, the ethics takes care of itself somewhere else. And in the military space, we often say the laws of war are the same in cyberspace as everywhere else, so we don't need new rules, we're as ethical as we need to be. And it's only a special case if the human is not in the loop, and that's not yet. But I make the completely contrary case that whichever sector you're working in, however sexy, however client-pleasing your application, if something goes wrong, the scope for moral panic is huge. The scope for moral panic, for people panicking and saying it's the fault of the technology, let's ban it, is enormous, because nobody out there, I include myself, really understands the way the minority like Claude and you in the audience do, what is leading to the error. And if humans make an error, of course that's terrible, but they're human, because to err is human. But we hold technology to a higher standard. So people who trust the technology because they're building it need to put themselves more often in the shoes of those who don't understand it. And one of the ways to do this is, as a startup CEO from Germany said to me, is, I go to a primary school once a month and I talk to them about what I do. And he said, they have maybe heard something, but I always come back with a new idea, if only for presentation. I'm not saying we need to sort of pester primary school children with AI, but we need to actively think about bringing the ignorant, and I say that deliberately, into the debate, and doing what Claude has done, which is producing books without equations so that people can get what it's about. The other piece, I think, is that we don't communicate louder enough about the good things, how safe it is, what we have done to produce machines which, while thinking for themselves, will respect our parameters. And I think on both of these areas, so communication and listening, we actually need government to create the space for those conversations. This is not just a dream I have. Helsing is probably the biggest AI startup in Europe. And I just Googled on its website and came across this during the time I was researching this speech. So there's a company which is still looking for VC money, and it talks a lot about ethics. And it talks about how it engineers ethics into its business model. And at the other end of the scale, in my work on AI in Brussels, I more often fail than succeed when I say to major leading global companies, put an AI vision at board level. A company like Fujitsu said that's a great idea, it's a sort of Japanese idea. In Europe, not so much, but I think it's important to ask yourself, could I say that? And if I couldn't, what do I do about it? So I think there are 2 points to watch. One is moral accountability for autonomous artificial agents. That can seem like a threat, because my AI doesn't need to be accountable. Somebody else is accountable. But I think actually it's a very important point to think about from the technology perspective. Could this be a help to me in developing my application? And the other point to watch is, are we condemned to go to autonomous systems because otherwise the Chinese have them or the Russians have them and we lose? Or are there other ways to find a breakthrough, for example, on human-machine teaming, whether in cyber defense or in other AI applications, or through some innovation pathways we're not yet prioritizing or talking about in AI, which are not around generative models, so that we can at least defend against Salah to the point that we don't need to deploy it ourselves. Florian Zeibel's machines in the quantum systems part are very helpful to Ukraine these days. His other venture, Stark, which is getting a lot of VC money, which is based in Europe, is designed to create Salah. He says, whether you turn it on or off, that's up to the people I sell it to. But there's a venture on that in Europe. So these questions are not just in the Sunday supplements. They're not just in the newspapers. They're around. And even if you're not in that business, the question, I think, is whether that debate will come and pollute your business. So if you're in that business, obviously you're thinking about it, but you're maybe not communicating enough. If you're not in that business, that illustrates why the moral panic can come back and bite an AI application even in civilian areas. So that's the summary of the things I've been trying to say. And as I say, I think as a non-technologist that if you build this into your thinking in developing apps, the problems are zero cost. I don't know if maybe some of us have played Angry Birds, I never have. The company that does it in Finland, Rovio, they always took the line with me as a regulator. You tell us what you want, we design it in zero cost. You come along 10 years later and tell us society expects X, Y, or Z, we can't afford it. And I think, therefore, seeing ahead strategically as technologists, as innovators, and thinking about the context is a success factor, and it is a factor for safety of development. So Benjamin Franklin said, we must all hang together or we will all hang separately. I'm glad this is in English because I can't translate it into French. But basically, I think if there's one crucial message for policy, it's do more together, 100 billion, not 1.5. And if there's one key message for technology from inside out, it's communicate more. Thank you very much.